Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. In today's episode, we welcome CNBC senior climate and real estate correspondent Diana Olick, who moderated a discussion about the current state of the housing market at NHC's Solutions for Housing Communications convening on April 3rd. Joining Diana in this discussion were industry leaders Ed Brady, President and CEO of the Home Builders Institute, Mark Jones, Chairman of the Mortgage Bankers Association, and Robert Pinnegar, President and CEO of the National Apartment Association. To view all the sessions from NHC's Solutions for Housing Communications convenings and our other events, please visit www.nhc.org.
Thank you so much for having me and to the organization. This should be a great discussion. I know we only have a little bit of time, so I want to get right to it, but I'd like everybody to introduce themselves first, so why don't we start at the end?
Bob Pinnegar, National Apartment Association.
Ed Brady of Home Builders Institute.
And I'm Mark Jones with Mortgage Bankers Association.
Okay, well, we're here to talk about housing affordability, and a lot of that obviously has to do with supply or lack thereof. We report these statistics all the time, and whether you're, I've seen everything range from 4 to 7 million housing units that the U.S. currently lacks that it needs. It depends on, who you're asking. Everybody's got a different number, but 4 to 7 million seems to be at 4, I think, is the more credible number. We have a lack of housing because we don't build enough homes. We are building a lot of apartments right now and a lot of supply coming on the market, but the vast majority of that new supply is in the upper tier, the Class A, the expensive, the unaffordable. We don't have enough low-income housing, as I'm sure you all know. So let's get to it. I want to start first about what are some of the barriers to building. So we could start with apartments or we could start with houses first. Who would like to begin on what are some of the biggest challenges in getting more built?
Yeah, go ahead.
We did a study on this. We did a first phase and a second phase a few years ago, and it ranges from public engagement to slow the process down, weaponizing, various laws around environmental issues. The first phase of the study when we did it was 4 communities. It was New York, San Diego, I want to say it was Austin, and we did a community in Florida. And San Diego was the most difficult to develop in the nation, which amazed me because I thought New York was going to be number 1 and a California property come in second. But it was really looking at the process and the timeline and the delays that are in there through litigation around environmental issues. And then we followed that up with another study that is much more comprehensive, and it shows that there's a consistent theme across all the communities in which we have problems, that we simply have a process that is broken. I mean, we have a national problem, but we don't have a national solution at this point.
And what I hear when I talk to the CEOs of the multifamily REITs and the developers is that it simply doesn't pencil. That's the constant term I hear. It doesn't pencil to build affordable housing. We talk about tax credits. We talk about, keeping part of the building affordable housing while the rest of it might be luxury, et cetera. What is it that doesn't pencil specifically? I know you're talking about regulations, but there's land, there's labor, there's material costs, there's zoning issues. What do you see as the number one, or is it all just the same?
The conversation that was up here for the previous panel talking about land. I mean, if you think about this, 75% of the land in this country is zoned single family. And so the remaining 25% is multifamily, it's commercial uses, it's industrial uses. We need to figure out how do we have more land that's available to develop, because that's a big issue. There's other issues that have come and gone. Financing costs is really an issue right now. Insurance rates are really an issue, but the underlying cost of land is something we can't get away from.
But labor, Ed, I know you want to talk about that.
I would just start with the 4 L's, right? You mentioned them. I start with labor because that's what I'm working with every day, but lending, land, legal, which is regulatory burdens. And so you combine all those 3 headwinds to providing housing in this country, it becomes very, very difficult. The regulatory burden in California is 40% on multifamily. The cost of a unit in California is 40% regulatory burden. That means the zoning, the land cost, the legal process to get it through. Concentrate on labor. I'm a builder by trade. I used to build homes in 90 days. Today, it takes 9 to 10 months to build a home, in part because there's not enough labor. So I'll have a foundation and it'll sit there for 30 days. Then I'll have a framing crew on it and it'll sit there for 30 days to get the plumbers in, then the electricians and so forth. So we have 400,000 empty, vacant jobs in the construction industry alone. And I know every industry is facing some of that coming out of the pandemic. But I would say, and hopefully get more comments, if we don't invest in the future of the labor concentration in this country on housing, we won't have affordable, we won't have luxury, we won't have market rate houses, because we cannot catch up to the 4 million, as you said, maybe some say 7 million units that were deficient on the supply and the demand. And the cost, as any economists would say, supply and demand. If you don't have the supply and the demand's there, the cost goes up. And so there's so many issues, but if we don't invest in the labor side of this, which means our young people, we're aging out 5 for every 2 that come into the industry, so the problem's going to get worse.
And you talk about investing, you already are investing. I'll tell you all, I was recently in Denver doing a story on Denver's housing issues and why some of it is a success and some is not. And we visited the Home Builders Institute. It's a builder's school, which allows, for free, young people, old people, whoever wants to become a home builder to come in and take a course. Not sure how many months it is, but they were in their training. It was a big warehouse, and they're learning how to do all the basics of construction, framing, plumbing, electrical, all that stuff that is being supported by the Home Builders Institute, also by several home builders themselves. But what was interesting to me when I was there was that when we spoke to the director there, she said, not only do we not have as many students as we could handle, but we don't have enough teachers, we don't have enough people in the trade. And when I ask, why aren't there people? I mean, these are good paying jobs, they have benefits, et cetera. The answer always is that home building was always a family business, and it is no longer that. Nobody's kid wants to follow in their father's footsteps to be a builder. They all want to go into tech or something else. And there's an immigration issue, because that's where we get the vast majority of our builders now. Can you address that either?
I would say there's still 70% of the home building companies in this country are small mom and pop shops. So they build 10 or less homes. Now that is diminishing because of the capital required and the risk required and the lending and the access and so forth. But we're training trades. And I think the best builder, I started cleaning out sump pits at the age of 12, became a superintendent through the years, and then became a builder. And I think that's where you start to become a really good builder. And so we're not populating those trades today, and therefore we're not populating the future builders in America. And our high school program is called Future Builders of America. And so we work on apprenticeships and we put a lot of money into labor, but we're not filling the pipeline. And that begins, frankly, at 5th and 6th and 7th grade and into the junior highs and certainly into the high schools, where 60%, maybe you guys reported this, 60% of the jobs in this country will not require, over the next 10 years, a college degree. And so we have to invest in that introduction to the trades, because there's a lot of diverse populations that don't even know it's a career path.
Now, you talked about financing. I'd like to get to that. Obviously, you talk to builders nowadays. He was talking about the small mom and pop builders and how they're shrinking. The smaller builders cannot get the financing as easily as the Lennars and the KBs and the Pulte homes to build these homes, or the big REITs. I don't want to get into the Fed, as we'll be here all evening, but when do you believe that financing for home construction, and how is it going to ease up? Because it's very tight right now, it's very expensive, and it's holding back on production.
Well, first of all, I agree with you. When you look at the larger builders, what they're really able to do there is to take some of the profitability that they have had in their homes and use that to subsidize the financing. So it's not like they've got this magical pool of money they come up with. If you look at the spread over an existing home versus a new home that existed 4 years ago, it's down dramatically, because they are using those dollars to subsidize that. And so in order to get the smaller builders to really get back in the game, we're going to have to see that these rates come down another probably 200 basis points to get back in the game. Then you'll start to see those builders resume their normal profits and not put so much towards the financing. So,
But what if they're out of business before that?
That could actually happen. That absolutely could happen. I do want to take a minute and talk about penciling. We were talking about the larger commercial deals didn't pencil. When you look at the residential side, those don't pencil either, particularly in the affordable space. A recent study I looked at showed that the cost of just putting a house in there to get all the permitting and all that done is about just over $93,000. And if you look at the median cost of a home, about $400,000, that's a quarter of it. You said it was 40% on the multifamily. It's fully 25%. If you look at that, where is there any money for a builder to build in that space at all? So rates have got to come down dramatically from where they're at right now. And we heard today, and now maybe it's only one cut this year instead of, we started at 4 and now we're down to 1.
And mortgage rates pop back up again.
Mortgage rates pop back up again, yes.
And also, I mean, to add on to that, we had a board meeting just a few weeks ago, not too far from here in DC, and we were asking questions about various factors and what was impacting things. And I had a member who said for the first time in their 40 years in the industry, insurance rates are actually being the thing that breaks the back of new development deals and even transactions at this point in time.
And that's where climate comes in.
We're seeing several borrowers using our forced place. Our members are using their forced place insurance because it's cheaper than what they're able to get on their own. It really is disturbing what's happening in insurance.
Now, you talk about the big builders having the advantage because they can finance, they can buy down mortgage rates, take a 7% rate and put it down to 5%. But that we're seeing in the earnings recently that it's really starting to kill their margins. And in fact, today we just saw a couple of downgrades on some big builders because of that margin pressure. And you talk to some of the big builders and they say, well, we're going to keep doing it until we can't anymore. And it sounds like they're getting to that breaking point when they start getting downgraded and their stock starts coming down.
So maybe there's hope for those smaller builders after all.
Maybe there's hope.
But think about the consequences of that. If they're building in many markets 85, 90% of the volume in Phoenix, for example, other than custom home builders and nobody else building, if we lose the big builders, look at the inventory problem. So we have to make sure that we don't lose the big builders because they are a critical mix. You know, I look at community bankers and, you know, a lot of your members, they are providing lending at the local level, but it's the risk that is problematic because of the price increases. So this is a vicious cycle of continuing 5 to 6% increase in pricing every year over the last plus years. And if we don't provide that inventory, that's going to continue. So I think the lending has softened a little bit, hasn't it, to the point where small developers can find the lending. It's the risk that they're adverse to after the crisis.
Well, my concern is if you've got the big builders buying that rate down from 7 to 5% and they stop doing that, you're going to lose a cohort of borrowers that can no longer afford it because they just don't qualify at the 7%. And that's a concern, and the demand will drop dramatically.
And we're already seeing that the builders, housing starts have not been anywhere near where they should be given what kind of demand we're seeing. And that's because of that. We are 40% below normal levels of total housing inventory in the country, both new and existing homes. So that's kind of where we are right now, even though people say, oh, there's more listings coming on in this spring market. It's not even close to enough. So I want to talk government, which in a lot of areas, we have the low-income housing tax credit, but there was, in our pre-call, we were talking about the cap. Who would like to attack that?
I reached out to members and had conversations with them. And really, essentially, what they said is the safety net is now smaller, and it's going to be more difficult to get financing because of the risk associated with the loans. And so that means either that other sources are going to have to step in, or state and local governments are going to have to put more money up. And so essentially, that's what's happened. To get specific numbers, they still want to look at it and understand what's going on with the market. But the action that was taken has had the opposite effect of what they intended it to be. Good intentions lead us to a bad place without information.
We recently, though, saw that President Biden has announced a slew of housing initiatives. They include a new neighborhood homes tax credit, the first tax provision to build or renovate affordable homes for home ownership, which they say would lead to the construction or preservation of over 400,000 homes. They're proposing a first-time homebuyer tax credit. We remember that from the great financial crisis, which did increase sales dramatically, I believe in 2010 to 2012. That would be $5,000, although the last one was $10,000. He's also talking about a $20 billion competitive grant fund as part of his budget to support communities across the country to build more housing and lower rents and home buying costs, supporting construction of affordable multifamily rental units. He also talks about getting investors out of the housing market and getting more of the investor rental homes out into the home buying population. Do you think any of this has a chance in Congress? at all? Because it sounds lovely, right? It sounds like we're fixed, we're done.
Not this year.
Short answer is no. The longer answer is going to take too long. And I would argue, and our members would argue, that there's already plumbing in place that they could do some of this.
Such as
The private activity bond authority that they already have that takes federal dollars and it puts it into the state. And then the state can parcel those monies out for whatever they see fit. HFAs have traditionally been a big part of that, and they would come up with mortgage credit certificates, for instance, or state bond programs. 3 and 4 and 5 years ago, when rates were so low, they got out of the habit of funneling some of those funds into housing, and it got used for other purposes. Now that rates are higher and there's a big disparity, putting that back in place and getting those states to use that more for housing is something that could happen quickly, and it would be as effective as that. Plus, the dollars would be going towards the intended purposes instead of going through the hands of the borrower, and you don't know if you're going to spend it on a vacation or really put it towards that mortgage. That, to me, is a faster path. And then if they wanted to do more, then take the path through Congress and allocate more funds and maybe earmark that it specifically has to go to housing. That's how it gets into the system faster, in my opinion.
I would say I have some optimism on the low-income housing tax credit. I think there's bipartisan support for that.
But is $5,000 in this market? I mean,
no, I'm talking about a low-income housing
the
tax credit increase in that public-private investment, right? So I agree with the others. You know, what the most exciting thing about the State of the Union, what the president has announced, is people are talking about housing for maybe the first time. When I was chairman of NHB, I tried to get people to talk about housing in the presidential election, and it was 15th down on the list. Every mayor, every council member is being addressed with affordability in housing and housing supply, whether it be a homeless situation or 60% of your income goes to rent. So that's the most exciting. You got more attention in the State of the Union probably in this last one than I've seen in the last 20 years, 30 years. And so will it get passed this year? You said no, I don't think so either. But if we don't get something passed in the next month or so, then it's election cycle and nobody's going to do anything. So I have optimism that people are starting to understand that we're at a crisis level of housing affordability and providing affordable housing for those that need it.
Now, you talk about a crisis level, but we seem to, at least from homeowners, have never been more wealthy. They just simply don't want to move. And so, because they have that kind of, as we call it, the golden handcuff effect of who wants to trade a 3% mortgage rate for a 7% mortgage rate. And so they're not going to sell their house. They're not going to move. Baby boomers aren't going to downsize. That move up line, the domino effect, all the way down to the $200,000 homeowner moving up to the $500,000 home, opening up that entry level house. What's it going to take to get sellers, especially when you have a financing situation like this, where, I mean, I should be moving. My kids are graduating college. I'm not going to sell my house because I have 2.75% on a 30-year fix.
70% of borrowers across the nation are below 4% right now. And with the current rate about 7%, you're right. It's not going to happen quickly. It's going to be something that's very, very slow. We believe that 5% or so, somewhere in the fives, is the breaking point where people will actually start looking at that. The other thing, we had, forgot her name, Sarah something, at one of our conferences. She used to work for Citibank, and she talked about our age group, because the boomers are so wealthy, to your point, they're not going to necessarily sell that home. They may keep that home as a rental and buy another home or buy a vacation home, let their kids, so it may not free up as much inventory as we need it to.
And you talk about rental versus home ownership. There's a big argument, and it was actually on our air today, that renting is no longer so bad. Home ownership is not the American dream. Apartment guy would say that.
The lifestyle renter has been something that's been around for almost 20 years. And it started off where there was a lot of people did not believe it was such a thing, but that is the case. And there have been a number of studies that have shown that if you invest your money in the stock market, your retirement, you're going to be more wealthy than if you bought a single family home. Now, granted, that depends on where you are in the country. From the standpoint of the industry and then the conversation about the baby boomers renting out the home, if you look at the totality of the rental housing in this country, you have somewhere around 43 million rental units. You have 19 million and change that are in communities of 5 units or larger. So the bulk of the nation's rental housing is sitting in 1 to 4 unit category, and those are truly the independent rental owner. And that is a group that nobody talks about. That's where the naturally occurring affordable housing is. Because if you have a single family home or a duplex or a fourplex, your motivation is to pay the mortgage and to keep some sort of reasonable cash flow there. Because if you have one vacancy, it may be your entire cash flow for a period of months until you can get it re-rented. So that's something that people aren't talking about right now, but that is a population that I worry about with the conversations that are occurring about housing at the national level, and especially rental housing. The demonizing of the industry is not going to help anybody. We have to use not just a whole of government, it needs to be a whole of country approach to solving this problem.
And I'm very interested in the demonizing because I get all these requests to do stories on the big bad investors who are destroying the housing market. And I've been doing this for 20 years. I came through the subprime mortgage crisis. I saw the companies that grew out of it, the American Homes for Rent, the Invitation Homes, the single family rental companies. And there were many, many of them. They all kind of conglomerated at the end, and then some got eaten by others and some cashed out. But the theory was back then that, okay, they're going to buy up all these foreclosed, distressed properties super cheap. They're going to rent them out for a couple of years, and then they're going to sell them back into the market. Well, lo and behold, they all found out, guess what? This is a good business. And the growth of that single family rental home market and this new class of investors grew exponentially. It's now grown into the build for rent market, which I find fascinating because I've been out to some of these communities, whether they're in Charlotte or out in Texas, where they're building full rental communities, and they build the homes designed specifically. They're slightly closer together. They all have all kinds of amenities, et cetera. They use different amenities inside the homes because they're rentals so that they can be better on wear and tear, that different than a for sale luxury builder might build. And these are really nice communities. And I've seen a lot of, not poor people moving in, people who say to me, I could afford to buy a home, but I choose not to because I want to have that availability to move and to maybe take a job somewhere else, or I want to put my money somewhere else. I don't believe in the housing market right now. I think it's overpriced. So my question is, why do we demonize? I realize in some parts, some areas of Atlanta, they say, well, the investors came in, they drove up the prices, they bought in all cash, and that made it impossible for the first-time buyer to get in. But that institutional investor is still only between 2 and 4% of the market right now,
yes,
which nobody seems to get,
and
but they are.
That single-family space of the rental we have right now is somewhere around 15 million units across the country. So it's still largely the independent owner that owns. The communities you're talking about, it's interesting. I've had conversations with members and asked them, because this is an area that I've tried to learn as much as I possibly can about, because it is still relatively new. The townhomes communities, the average age is about 35 years old. The single-family home communities is about 45 years old. So that goes back to people are at a point in their earning careers that they're making the conscious choice that they want to rent this particular product in this particular location. It may be school district, it may be job security is not what they want to buy a home, or they may decide they just don't want to buy a home.
And if they're doing build to rent, then they're adding to the housing stock. Maybe it's the rental stock, but they're still adding to it. Yeah. So if landlords are now building homes, why is that so bad?
I don't think it's bad. And number one, I don't know how they pencil either, by the way. When we're talking about apartments, I don't know how they're doing it with the cost and the financing and the regulatory burdens and all the things that they're doing. But they're smart people, so they're figuring it out. But I think it's almost a defensive nature that we're defending the American dream, or part of the American dream in home ownership, against this rental market. So I think the death of the American dream in home ownership, I think, is premature. I think people are buying houses at a later age. They have a little bit of PTSD on the 30-some that went through their parents losing their home, being foreclosed on, the jingle mail times. I think it will come back. It still makes sense. It's still, you said the homeowners are the wealthiest they've ever been. Get rid of the cap gain and open up the opportunity for more inventory to come on the market. You asked about how you get more supply. Yes, interest rates are a problem, but they have equity in their home. But when they sell their home, they got to pay a higher price to replace that home. So get rid of the cap gain restriction to bring more inventory onto the market. As an example, we can be innovative in approach in bringing some of these existing homes onto the market. I don't demonize the build to rent. I think it's a good product. I think it's a good market. Communities throughout the country, I think, would rather have, not to disparage apartments or anybody that rents, home ownership is ownership in a community. And so I think it's still there and it will come back.
I agree with you. There needs to be a range of options so people can choose what they want. If they want home ownership, that's a path forward for them. If they feel as though they want the flexibility of living in a rental community or in either a scattered site, single family home or a build to rent community, that's their option. But I think that we too often forces try to pit the various segments of the industry against each other. And really, we need to do a better job of being together to move forward, to be able to achieve the goal that's going to make sure we all survive and are all successful.
One other suggestion that I would have on the affordable side is something we haven't talked about yet, and that is renovation. Renovate to rent, renovate to sell. FHA has a program called 203K, which is a renovation loan. You know of it. It was done initially in 1985, and the maximum loan back then for a streamline, which is a quickie, if you will, $35,000. It hasn't changed until last month. They raised it all the way to $50,000. It should be about $135,000.
As anyone who has tried to redo their kitchen knows.
So if we want to revitalize the inner city housing stock, we need to raise that up to a normal level. The other thing was, back before 1985, investors were allowed to participate in that program. Now, they had to put more money down. They did away with the program because it was abused back then. I think with the proper protections put in place, having that come back in, raising that amount, allowing investors to come in, we could refresh a whole supply city by city and create a lot more housing stock that is affordable because it's going to be a much lower starting point. So utilizing that program to its fullest, I really think could help and not have to rely on new homes for it.
And building on that, the sexiest story around right now is the death of office is going to be a boon for affordable housing. Let's just convert every empty office building that you see into an affordable housing building. Discuss, because not every building can happen. Not every financing method to do that works. Let's go down the line, because I love this subject. I'm actually going to New York next week to do a story on the largest one that was done in New York City at the South Street Seaport, and the apartments there are incredibly expensive.
You talked about herding cats at the last, you weren't here yet. They were talking about herding cats at municipality meetings, but this would be the same case. We know of several in D.C. that are underway. And
D.C. is actually the #1 office conversion market in the country.
And New York's got some going on, but it's not a silver bullet. It's probably one of few things that we need to do, but to your point, it's very, very difficult. I'll leave it to the other panelists to dive in a little deeper.
I'm not an expert on it, but I don't know what, talk about market rate. I mean, they're very expensive, right? So that doesn't solve an affordability issue because it doesn't pencil for affordability. We go back to the pencil. And many buildings probably will cost less if you tear them down and rebuild something on that piece of property. So I think it's a problem with the commercial market, which I'm not an expert on.
Well, it's essentially, you're looking for a needle in a haystack, because you need a floor plate that is of such a configuration and such a size that you can actually have units where light can get into them. This typically is product that was built from, say, the 1920s to maybe the late 60s in many parts of the country. So that is a limiting factor there. But as you were saying, you have issues with infrastructure that has to be now put through a building that may be 60, 70, or 100 years old. You need a lot of subsidy to make this work. And it is less expensive to tear the building down and do it all over again properly with proper construction. And that's the unfortunate thing. I was at
because it's terrible for the environment.
And that's terrible for the environment. I was at a HUD
Real
meeting.
estate contributes 40% to global greenhouse gas emissions. I'm done.
I was
Goes back to an affordability issue, though, too, right? We got to balance this.
Yeah, I was at a HUD meeting and somebody had suggested that you take these office buildings and turn them into homeless shelters because they would lend themselves to communal living. And I'm like, well, I've never heard of that before. But that is probably the closest you're going to get to housing for a lot of these large floor plate buildings.
And you haven't even discussed all the zoning morass that you'd run into to do this. And once you got through it, the cost, is it really going to be affordable, or is it going to be high-end housing for people that would otherwise buy a high-rise condo?
And
But
where's
what about the
grocery store,
financing? I mean, do you
restaurant?
see more financing for this kind of stuff?
We're starting to see some of it, but
Because cities like New York has a whole program that they want to convert these buildings.
there's not a lot of demand for the financing yet because it's not really, it's in experimental stage right now, really.
It's going to take huge government subsidies to make this work. I mean, look at, you talk about climate, the greenhouse gas reduction, the billions of dollars we're spending, not in the apartment business, but I've been told that it will take $80,000 a unit to convert a gas unit to an electrification unit. Just tear the darn thing down.
But cities are mandating that now, Local Law 92.
So I think there has to be some common sense to where we're going to spend some of the subsidized dollars to, and I think some of that makes sense. You know better.
You're going to have a situation where operators are not going to be able to convert. And so what is the value of the property at that point? So you're going to talk about a huge, massive loss that's going to impact the industry, which will also impact, local tax rolls. It's well intended, but we need to have a transition plan to get there that is going to be cost effective, because without that, it's a recipe for disaster.
I want to talk about, I know we don't have a ton of time left. In fact, we have 2 minutes, but quickly, innovation in housing. How could that, and by innovation, I'm talking about the tiny home movement, the 3D printed home movement, all the kind of fun stories that we get to do about innovation in housing, but they also provide an opportunity for more affordable, smaller housing. Does anybody see that as an answer, or is that just a one-off?
There's been a lot of companies that have tried to start this whole modular development and building. Once their seed money ran out, then they sort of went away. I know
building homes in factories.
I know that Greystar is working on their LTV product, which is intended to be something that would be very affordable. It's modular construction. That's the only one that I'm aware of that's actually playing with that at this point in time.
I think it's capital intensive, and we have transportation issues. So in the rural areas throughout the country, it won't pencil again to build a manufacturing plant and be able to do modular homes within a 300-mile radius. Just you can't cover the country. I think multifamily, I think maybe the Lego type atmosphere where you might be able to have some efficiencies, but 3D housing, I've seen them printed. You still got to do electrical, plumbing, all the other things that add to this. So the cost affordability, I'm not sure that it's going to solve that problem. I saw recently robots that lay out a room to drywall. So I think there is some, as an industry, we've been behind the productivity side as an industry for years. I don't see it solving the problem, but it should be a piece of the solution.
And I would add to that you need each agency to approve these various things, unless you're just going to put them to the banks, and the banks really aren't interested in taking that kind of a risk. So the modular manufactured space is different. The agencies already do those lending in those, or will buy loans that are financed by those properties. I think on the zoning side of things, there's a misconception of what's a true modular home and what's a trailer that came down on an axle. But as far as the agencies are concerned, those are loans that we can do and sell to them. The micro homes and the ones that are built by robots and that, they've got to go through a period of time where the agencies can vet them and approve them before you're going to get, an acceptance across the entire ecosystem.
So AI will just solve it all in about 5 years, right?
Are you sure?
We're over time. So thank you very much, gentlemen. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.